All right. So before I forget, we do have the copies of Mind Your Faith for those of you who are wanting a copy. After services, let me know. We got a box here with some copies of this in there, so if anybody wants one, just let me know. And apparently Doy has actually updated it. This is the second edition, and he updated it and added in some more notes and stuff like that. So I'm actually kind of curious to see what the differences are between the first version and the second version. So if anybody wants a copy of that, let me know. Also, we have the flyers on the table in the back for our gospel meeting coming up. So if anybody wants one of those, I also send it over email. If anybody wants to email it to somebody, you should have it in your emails. And if I don't have your email address, give it to me and I'll make sure you get one. All right, so last week we studied the differences between the American Standard and the King James and the different sets of manuscripts and text types that both are based upon. And of course, from the American Standard, most of the modern versions have come from those. And as I mentioned, what we'll focus on for this class is to focus on the English versions that we have. The American Standard, New American Standard, King James, New King James, the NIV, NEV, all the different ones that we have. We're going to kind of look at what the origins of those are and kind of which ones are perhaps better for us as students of the Bible, which ones might we want to avoid, and that sort of thing. So these notes are actually kind of a combination of a couple of different sources, and I've kind of merged them together to kind of be cohesive, so that's why I include the disclaimer at the top. So since 1895, many archaeological manuscript discoveries have been made, which have pronounced judgment on some of the renderings found in the King James. The single most important discovery was that of Egyptian papyri. In 1895, Adolf Deisman published a volume given the unassuming title Bible Studies, which revolutionized New Testament scholarship. Deisman discovered that ancient papyrus scraps buried in Egyptian garbage dumps some 2,000 years ago contained Greek, which was quite similar to the Greek of the New Testament. He concluded that the Greek of the New Testament was written in the common language of the day, and it was not the dialect which only the most elite could understand. That was kind of the assumption up until this point, was that the Greek that the New Testament was written from was a type of elite Greek that was only really for the upper echelons of society. The difference was in dialect and the fact that in application, the thought process was that common people don't need to read it. And that was kind of part of the Catholic Church and the Church of England. That was kind of part of their reasoning too, was that because this was meant for the upper echelon of society, common people don't need to read it. Okay, they just need to take our word for it and understand the reasons why we have given them that we do things. That was kind of their thought process. But that's why Deisman, with what he found, it proves that no, this was written in everyday common language. Okay, this was written in everyman language in the Greek, which meant that everybody in Greek times, or in the New Testament times, would have been able to read it. Okay, this wouldn't have just been for people who were highly educated. These would have been for just commoners who were able to read the common Greek. It was not the dialect which only the most elite could understand. Since Deisman's discovery, translators have endeavored to put the New Testament into language the average person could comprehend, just as it was originally intended. Not only that, but the papyri have helped us to understand many words which were only guessed at by King James translators. So there are two implications of what Deisman did, well, really what he found, because of what he found and what that meant for the translations. First, if the apostles wrote in easy to understand terms, then translations of the Bible should reflect this. We ought not to translate with big 50-cent religious sounding words if the original was not written that way. The King James word propitiation, for example, basically means satisfaction or appeasement. That is, God is satisfied with Christ's payment for our sins. Our Lord's final word from the cross, "It is finished," has been found on papyrus business documents, on receipts, if you will. It means paid in full. I thought that was interesting. I hadn't heard that before. I've looked at the phrase and everything, but I never had heard that was a kind of common term in the Greek language, paid in full. I thought that was interesting. In other words, Bible translations need to be clear. One of the obvious proofs of this is that the gospel offends people, and it cannot be offensive unless it is understood. I thought that was a great point, too. Yes, the Bible does offend people, and it is meant to prick people's hearts, and unless it actually draws those lines and makes it clear what it's talking about, it can't do that. Second, the papyri discoveries have helped us to understand words which the King James translators merely guessed at. For example, in the King James Version of John 3:16, the Greek word translated only begotten really means one and only, or unique. The Bible then does not say that Jesus was the begotten Son of God, which might suggest that he had a beginning, but that he is the unique Son of God. Now, this is where, some of these I include editor's note, that's me. To be fair, this term is only ever used in the New Testament in connection with children. So that's why it's translated the way that it is in the King James, the only begotten Son, okay, is because it's only ever used in connection to children. But the point as it pertains to Christ, the source is valid in that Christ was not created. He was not born in heaven and then sent to earth. And that's his point, is the fact that this is ultimately the term is meant to resonate with the understanding that he's the only one and there is none else like him. And that's what the term literally means. And that's true. Okay? But in fact, the interesting thing is, elsewhere in the New Testament where that term is used, it is used in connection with who the child is. So it's the unique, the only one son, for instance, in Hebrews, where Abraham sacrificed his only begotten son, Isaac, on the altar. Okay, that one and only, that unique son, because he was the only one. Okay, and so they go hand in hand, but to make it clear, he was the only one. And I think that certainly applies to Jesus as well. Any thoughts through that part? I don't want anybody to be confused.
Are you reading out of this thing?
No, so these notes aren't printed out yet. Sorry. I'm sorry, Kathy. No, these aren't printed out yet. Not yet.
Okay.
Lord willing, by Sunday I'll have these printed out. No. All right. So finally, there have been philosophical influences. That is, the theory of translation is being revamped today. Missionaries, this is people who go overseas into foreign places to teach the gospel in general. A significant contribution toward this end because they are eager to see a particular tribe read the Bible in its own language. We talked a little bit about that regarding the different translations in the different languages and how the effort has been to translate it directly from the Greek. And that's one of the points he's making. These differences, textual, informational, philosophical, have been the parents of a new generation of Bible translations. But are these translations any good? And are they any better than the King James? And so this is where the King James and the American Standard, being Old English, for lack of a better phrase, kind of older English, stands kind of separate from the New King James, New American Standard, and some of the newer translations that we have. So in some of the translations, in particular, the Old American Standard, the original version of the American Standard, left out certain passages. And so this is what this is about. Where have all the verses gone? The modern translations seem to have cut out many of the most precious lines of Scripture. They end Mark's gospel at the 8th verse of chapter 16. They omit the reference of the angel of the Lord stirring the waters at the pool of Bethesda, verse 4 of John chapter 5. And most notably, they excise the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8. Besides omissions, these modern versions make significant changes in the text. For example, in 1 Timothy 3:16, the King James reads, God was manifest in the flesh. But most modern translations read, He was manifest in the flesh. In Revelation 22 and in verse 19, the King James speaks of the book of life, while virtually all modern versions speak of the tree of life. Altogether, there are hundreds of textual changes between the King James and modern translations. And so this particular essay, and I'm going to include it in our bibliography when I reprint the bibliography, his point was to note some of the differences and to recognize which translations go word for word, which ones are thought to thought, and which ones paraphrase. Those are the three main categories of modern translations that we have. Word for word translations on one end, thought for thought, which is kind of a mixture between the two, and then paraphrase, which completely substitutes word for the interpreter's or the translator's interpretation of what the passage means. Okay, and that's why it's important to kind of be aware of which one's which. So first, the textual changes in the modern translations affect no major doctrine, and that's something we pointed out before with regard to the actual Greek texts. The deity of Christ, the virgin birth, salvation by grace alone. I include that salvation by grace alone is accurate in that we've been saved by grace through faith, and faith requires obedience, and all the rest are still intact. Though certain passages are omitted or changed, the doctrines are not. This goes back to how some of the texts that the American Standard is based on, they left out, at the end of Mark chapter 16, it stops at verse 8. And then in some texts, the rest of Mark 16 is actually attached to some other text, and it kind of varied throughout some of the different variations. But this is why the King James puts it all together, because the majority of all the New Testament texts have the end of Mark 16 where it is. Okay? And it just goes to show that the different variations of what these translations are based on is why some of them are a little bit different. Most translations today actually include the full part of Mark chapter 16. Sometimes it may be bracketed. Sometimes there might be a footnote saying that in the NT text, this isn't here. That would be the text upon which the American Standard is based. So that's what he's talking about with some of those differences. Anything so far? Any questions? Second, the textual changes in these modern translations are based on the most ancient manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. These manuscripts date from early in the 2nd century AD. But the Greek text behind the King James, we've talked about this a good bit, belong to a group of manuscripts called the Byzantine text, which are much more recent. On the other hand, although these manuscripts are more recent, they comprise at least 80% of the 5,000 plus manuscripts of the New Testament, of the Greek manuscripts that we presently have. It is theoretically possible that at times these manuscripts point to an early tradition as well. And we actually talked about that last class or class before last by looking at the differences between the Byzantine and Alexandrian text type. Because the Byzantine text type would have actually been the type of Greek written in the area that the New Testament writers were, that the likelihood of it being the Byzantine dialect of Greek is much greater than it would have been from the Alexandrian text type. Alexandrian being in Egypt, whereas our New Testament writers were centered around Greek and Asia Minor and Judea, and that sort of thing. All right, so which translation is best? One of the best safeguards you can follow is to stay away from the sectarian translations or those done by an individual. Sectarian means done by a certain denomination. For instance, the New World Translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses is the best known sectarian translation. Translations by individuals include Moffat's, Weymouth's, J.B. Phillips, the Living Bible, Kenneth West's expanded translation, and the Berkeley New Testament. So those are all examples of single translators who might have a significant impact on the words that are being used. Yes, ma'am. Okay. So going forward, we talk about some of the different translations. For instance, the King James. The King James Bible has, with good reason, been termed the noblest monument of English prose. That's in the Revised Version preface. Above all its rivals, the King James Version has had the greatest impact in shaping the English language. It is a literary masterpiece, but lest anyone wishes to revere it because it was, quote, good enough for St. Paul. I've actually heard that. I've actually had somebody mention that to me. It was good enough for Paul. Paul wasn't reading the King James or writing in King James or some such nonsense. We must remember that the King James Bible of today is not the King James of 1611, and we mentioned that as well. In fact, I think I mentioned that the latest revision was 1901. That was actually the American Standard. The latest revision of the King James, I believe, was 1756, I believe. It has undergone 3 revisions, incorporating more than 100,000 changes, and that's just kind of bringing in better, more accurate words than what they had in 1611. Further, there are over 300 words in the King James that no longer mean what they meant in 1611. If one wishes to use a Bible that follows the same Greek and Hebrew texts as the King James, I recommend the New King James Version. The New King James, generally speaking, was meant to kind of just update the language of the King James to make it easier to read. Primarily, the biggest, I guess, cursory difference is the removal of the these and the thys and all that stuff. And so that is one of the points that makes it a little bit harder to preach, for instance, from the King James, because almost every time you go to a passage, there's at least one word somewhere that you end up having to define and explain because it doesn't mean the same thing, or we never use it in our modern vernacular. And especially for visitors and people who aren't familiar with the Bible, it kind of necessitates the need to kind of explain what those terms are. And so it's just a little bit easier to bypass that and use more modern terms. And that's why. So anything on the King James? All right. Revised Standard Version. The RSV was completed in 1952 and was intended to be, in part, a revision of the King James. Of course, it used the ancient manuscript of the NT. That's the ASV version of the Greek New Testament that we're talking about, resulting in the omission of several verses and words. But the wording was still archaic. The RSV attempts to be a word-for-word translation where possible. And even though this wasn't included, the King James is a word-for-word translation. That, to be clear, that's also applicable to the King James. The NRSV, which is the New Revised Standard Version, follows the same principle of translation, though has now become more gender-inclusive in its approach. At times, this is very helpful. At other times, it is misleading. And that's one thing to note, is that in some of these translations, there's even some translations that have removed any gender reference to God being male. Okay? Even though he's called our Father, certainly he's a spirit. There is no gender in terms of the spirit. But he is presented to us as Father. Okay? Not mother or not female. It's always, in fact, all three, the Spirit, the Father, and the Son, are all represented as male. And there are some Bibles that are attempting to make it more gender neutral for whatever reason. That's sometimes they try to do that. Now, the NRSV, I don't think goes as far as trying to gender neutralize God, but in other places where, like, for instance, in certain places where man is mentioned, and it's actually what it means is mankind, not just the gender man or male, it generalizes it into something like all of humanity or something like that. And that's okay, because we understand that's what is meant. So that's what it means, is that sometimes it's helpful, at other times it's careful to take, or someone has to be careful when reading them like that, because sometimes people can take liberty with that type of thing. Anything through the RSV or the NRSV. The New American Standard. The NASB is something of an evangelical counterpart to the RSV. It too was intended to be something of a revision of the King James, although, and yes, that's true, technically it's also a revision of the American Standard. There are three major differences between the RSV and the NASB. First, the New American Standard is less archaic in its wording. Second, its translators were more conservative theologically than the RSV translators. Third, because of the translator's desire to adhere as closely to the wording of the original, often this translation is stilted and wooden in terms of its flow of speech, is what it's referring to. Still, the NASB is probably the best word-for-word translation available today. That's his opinion. Personally, I don't like the New American Standard. There's certain passages where it's not as accurate, because our modern language is less accurate than it used to be in some ways. And so it kind of dilutes it just a little bit, enough for me not to like it anyway. Yes, ma'am?
I just want to bring to our memory that when these people were writing these or translating them, they weren't using the King James.
Right.
They were using the So
Yes.
just to be clear, when you say it was a revision of the King James, they weren't looking at the King James.
Right, and then
writing it differently. They went back to the manuscript.
Right.
And used those to get as close to it as they could. So it's not mistake after mistake after mistake.
Right.
Interpretation. It is translation of the original text.
Yeah. In fact, it maybe instead of revision, a better word would be an update. No, I don't know, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah, even the New King James, it's all based on the Greek texts. It's not based on, well, this is what the King James says, so let's just kind of change up the words a little bit and make it more modern. It went back to the Greek text, but they used the focus. A lot of it was on, like for instance, the New King James is based on the same Textus Receptus that the King James is based on. American Standard and the New American Standard are all based around the same type of Greek texts. And so that's what it means by revisions, in that it uses the same texts to represent in English what those are saying. So, anything else to the NASB? Okay. The New English Bible. The NEB was completed in 1971 after a quarter of a century of labor. It marks a new milestone in translation. It is not a revision, but a brand new translation, which is to say it utilized texts that hadn't been utilized by some of the others. It is a phrase-for-phrase translation. Unfortunately, sometimes the biases of the translators creep into the text. The REB, which is the Revised English Bible, follows the same pattern. Excellent English, though not always faithful to the Greek and the Hebrew. And this is part of the give and take that sometimes you run into because of the inaccuracy of English, or I guess I should say the
Diversity.
or lack of versatility of English. Because the Greek was so precise. I mean, one word could represent an entire sentence or several sentences in English. It makes it a lot harder to represent it in a brief amount of time in translation. And so, in some cases, and in fact, this is mentioned a little bit later, you have to kind of balance between the word-for-word translation, whereas substituting what it means in English is not exact word for word, but it is more, or say, it's not as literal, but it is what's needed. It's what's best to be able to understand what's going on. Let's see. The New International Version. The NIV was published in 1978. It may be considered a counterpart to the NEB. It is more a phrase-for-phrase translation than a word-for-word translation. And the scholars were generally more conservative than those who worked on the NEB. I personally, and this is not me, this is the source, I personally consider it to be the best phrase-for-phrase translation available today. However, its major flaw is in its simplicity of language. The editors wanted to make sure it was easy to read. In achieving this goal, they often sacrificed accuracy. In particular, in the New Testament, sentences are shortened, subordination of thought is lost, conjunctions are deleted. The New World Translation. A word should be said about the New World Translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses. Due to the sectarian bias of the group, as well as the lack of genuine biblical scholarship, I believe that the New World Translation is by far the worst translation in English dress. It purports to be word for word, and in most cases is slavishly literal to the point of being terrible English. But ironically, whenever a sacred cow is demolished by the biblical writers themselves, the Jehovah's Witnesses twist the text and resort to an interpretive type of translation. In short, it combines the cons of both worlds with none of the pros. When he says sacred cow, I had to kind of think, what is he talking about there? It's the give and take, like we said, of the word-for-word literal translation and the thought. Anytime they came across text that didn't support their thought process of the Mormon Church, the Jehovah's Witnesses, they twisted it. That's why whenever a sacred cow is demolished by the biblical writers themselves, whenever the writers themselves would say something, write something that was contrary to the Jehovah's Witness doctrine, they would twist it and be disingenuous with the translation. So they were word for word and literal to an extreme on one side, And in cases where it spoke kind of against their belief system, they went extremely soft in the translation. So anyway, for those of you who didn't know, the New World Translation, it was Jehovah's Witness associated. Now you know. I would highly recommend not utilizing that one. The New English Translation. This is actually the newest translation, newest version that we have today. The NET Bible or New English Translation, and again, keep in mind this opinion is from the source, has all the earmarks of a great translation. It may well be more accurate than the NASB, more readable than the NIV, and more elegant than either. In addition, the notes are genuine gold mine of information, unlike those found in any other translation. Now, I do have the NET. In fact, I have it on my tablet because it was on sale for 99 cents. So I went ahead and got it, and I looked at it, and there's really not... I mean, there are different, it's a little bit more modern than the New King James that I read from, that I use to preach from. So some of the terms are a little bit more modern, which throws me off. But in terms of accuracy, there's not really anything that I have found. Again, I haven't read all of it, Genesis to Revelation, but I haven't really found anything that I would say was inaccurate. Again, as English goes, there obviously is understanding of context as well. After cursory examination of the NET, there doesn't seem to be anything significantly different to that of the New King James, aside from sounding weird given its modern language. However, proceed with caution, as this is a very new version, and there may be something not accurately translated, given the inaccuracy of modern English, which may lead to an inaccurate application. More study of the NET is needed. A major update, in fact, that's one of the things that I read about it, is they're working on a major update to send out this year for the NET. Whether that means a little bit more accurate word utilization or whatever, however you update a translation. I don't know how you do that, but they're doing it. So, yes, sir.
Did you glance at his deduction over? He talked about the gold mine of...
Okay, so there's notes, and that's actually really interesting because there's two different versions of the NET. There's the NET by itself, the bare bones, if you will. Then there's the notes. And the notes is really interesting because what they included, like, for instance, in Mark chapter 16, as of verse 9 to the end of the chapter, it's included in the NET. But in the notes section, it shows here's why these versions don't include this because of these manuscripts, and here's why the King James and these others do include it because of these manuscripts. And so it's kind of it's not really a commentary. It's not written by one person. It's just more...
facts and you make your own.
Exactly. Yeah. So like with the differences between the King James and the American Standard, you wouldn't be missing anything because it'll still be there in the text. It'll just tell you, hey, this is different between this version and that version, and here's why. And then you can decide. So it is really interesting, and I actually anticipate. I'm kind of curious to kind of look through the NET more. I actually looked at it with some problematic passages in the past that the New American Standard kind of didn't get very well and that sort of thing. Problematic passages like Romans chapter 8 and different ones. And the NET, at least as far as all of the others go, like the NIV, is more accurate. So if I were going to choose a more modern translation, I would choose the NET over the New American Standard, for instance, especially with those extra notes, because that really does make a difference, at least in terms of study. All right. The New Living Translation. Tyndale House Publishers, we remember William Tyndale. He was the author, the first one to present an English translation of the New Testament. Tyndale House Publishers launched the New Living Translation in 1996, a revision of the Living Bible. Like many other translations it took 7 years to produce, the goal was to communicate the meaning of the ancient text as accurately as possible to the modern reader. 90 biblical scholars labored to make the text fresher and more readable, fresher, more modern, conveying whole thoughts in everyday language rather than translating word by word. And so this is where you start kind of going into from the word for word translations into the thought for thought and even into the paraphrase. And I'll talk about that in a minute. The English Standard Version. The English Standard was first published in 2001, is considered an essentially literal translation. 100 scholars produced it based on faithfulness to the historic Orthodox text. They delved into the meanings of the Masoretic text, consulting the Dead Sea Scrolls, a lot of that's Old Testament too, and other sources. It's extensively footnoted to elaborate on why the text choices were made. They meet every 5 years to discuss revisions. There's that one. So those are the main different versions that you would find in a Bible bookstore. Okay, you go in, you look at the different versions, you're going to come across the big four: King James, New King James, American Standard, New American Standard, and then you're going to have like the NIV, the NLT, the NET now. So all these different types of versions, the NIV, and this is kind of just a rundown of what they are. And here in a minute, I've actually got a graph that shows you on a scale of word for word all the way to paraphrase where all of these line up. It's actually really, really neat. It's interesting to me anyway. So anything through that particular part. All right. Does translation philosophy really matter? Most people believe that different Bible translations are simply a function of varying levels of readability, though all are roughly similar in accuracy. That's what people think. Translations are not equal in accuracy, and readability may come at the expense of precision to God's words and therefore His message. Before the middle of the 20th century, there was only one basic philosophy of Bible translation: word for word, or also known as formal equivalence. In other words, whatever the equivalent phrase or term in the English would be for that particular thought in the Greek, that's what was translated. This translation philosophy placed a premium on making the original languages transparent to the reader to the extent that the English grammar would allow. This translation theory is grounded in two essential facts. There's the reasoning as to why word for word is, especially among, for lack of a better phrase, conservative Bible students and people who study the Bible, the idea of the inspiration of the text, that God didn't just inspire the thoughts, He inspired the words themselves. The fact that God inspired not only thoughts of the biblical writers, but also the words, and there's a bunch of verses that back that up. Since God inspired the words, one must be hesitant to place a disproportionate weight on readability at the expense of accuracy. It should be noted, however, that the English language changes. Many modern readers would be extremely hard-pressed to understand the English that John Wycliffe spoke in the 14th century, or the authorized version of the 17th century. So this is John 3:16 in the authorized version. For God, in our English, is so loved the world, or loved so the world, that He hath given His Son, or has given His only begotten Son, that each man that believeth in Him perish not, but have everlasting life. Okay? Can you imagine me? I mean, I can only imagine trying to preach out of something like that today. That's not, I'm having to just kind of, because it's a little bit of, it's not just Old English. There's also a little bit of, what was it? Was it German? There was also a little bit of, it was a hybrid version. It was English and something else. I forget what the other thing was. That if thou, so this is Romans 10, verse 9, if you acknowledge basically in thy mouth the Lord Jesus Christ and believeth in thine heart that God reside, or that God had risen Him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. Romans 10, verse 9. So obviously, we should be glad we do have updated English versions. Word-for-word translation theory does not suggest the preservation of archaic English. It attempts to render the original biblical languages as close as possible to their contemporary equivalents. And then the second point that he makes on this is that thoughts cannot be disconnected from the words that produce them. This is true in the Bible as it is all aspects of communication. Scholar Raymond Van Leeuwen says it is hard to know what the Bible means when we are uncertain about what it says. And this is an article he wrote. We really do need another Bible translation in the sense that the article he wrote was about making sure there is a sincere, modern, word-for-word translation. and not just some translation that just gives us the basic thoughts or the gist, so to speak, that there needs to be a modern word-for-word translation. In other words, even if one didn't hold to the verbal inspiration of Scripture, changing words necessarily changes the resulting meaning. And that's absolutely true. When you start changing up words or substituting things instead of what the text actually says, you change the thought. And this is one area that, and this is part of the reason why sometimes we come across people who consider themselves Christians that think we look too deeply at things, that we're too detail-oriented, that we're too focused on what it actually says as opposed to the gist of it. Because a lot of them are probably studying from a lot of these Bibles that do just give them the gist of it. Okay, all they really want to know is a rundown of what does it really mean. And so a lot of people don't really appreciate the fact that this is what it actually says, and that's more important than just the gist of it.
Michael,
Yes, ma'am.
a comparison might be in a recipe. If you're cooking something and you change it, maybe salt and sugar looks the same.
Yeah.
But you put a cupful of sugar, makes a cupful of salt.
Right. That's
You've got something completely different.
That's a great point. That is a great analogy. Yes, absolutely. It may look the same, it may kind of seem the same, but if you start changing stuff up, you're going to start changing thoughts. Absolutely. Yeah. An essentially literal translation attempts to make the original biblical languages as transparent as possible to the reader. It gives the reader the best view of the original wording of the biblical writers. The focus of the essentially literal translation is on word-for-word precision. On the other end of the translation spectrum are versions which attempt to translate the ideas of the biblical authors. These are often characterized as thought-for-thought translations. Most translations fall somewhere within this continuum. It is true that less literal translations may be more readable, but often at the expense of accuracy and intended cross-reference. The New American Standard, ESV, King James, New King James are superb choices for those who hold transparency to the original text as a premium for an excellent translation. Originally, the Bible was written in Hebrew and some Aramaic for the Old Testament and Greek for the New Testament. It is a profound challenge and responsibility to translate Scripture into the native tongue of the reader in such a way we can understand what God has said. That's a good point. Okay, dynamic equivalence versus form. This is basically the difference between word for word and just getting the gist or the thought of it. Most laymen today think that a faithful translation of the Bible means a word for word translation. If the original has a noun, they expect a noun in the translation. If the original has 16 words, they don't want to see 17 words in the translation. We might call this translation formal equivalence. The King James, Old American Standard, and the New American Standard, even the New King James, come closest to this ideal. On the other end of the spectrum is a phrase-for-phrase translation, or dynamic equivalence translation. It is not so concerned about the grammatical form of the original language as it is of the meaning of the original. A dynamic equivalence translation is more interpretive, but it is also easier to understand. The New International Version, in part, and the New English Bible follow this philosophy. Anyone who has ever learned a second language knows that a word, when they say word for word, this is to the extreme, the literal, the house blue word for word. Translation is impossible much or most of the time. Idioms in one language need to be paraphrased. Even the King James translators realized this. In a couple of places in the Old Testament, the Hebrew text literally reads, God's nostrils enlarged. I didn't know that. But the King James has something like, God became angry, which is what the expression means. And in many places in Paul's letters, the King James reads, God forbid. But the original has neither God nor forbid. Literally it says, may it never be, as most modern translations render it. But in King James time, that's how they would have said that, God forbid. In fact, to a certain extent, it has survived today because of the King James. But it literally means, may it never be. Therefore, when we speak of faithfulness in translation, we need to clarify the question, faithfulness to form or faithfulness to meaning. Sometimes faithfulness to one involves lack of fidelity to the other. All right, we'll stop there. We will pick up and finish this next Wednesday night. There's not a whole lot left. Some of these are just charts. And then we will move on, going back to 300 AD. We'll talk about the Catholic Church, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on these denominations. I'm planning on spending maybe 1 week, 2 tops, on denominations, depending on just how in-depth we're going to get, but preferably 1 week per denomination as we go forward in the timeline. All right? Thank you, everybody. Appreciate your attention.